on COVID-19 stress moderates the mediational pathway of fandom identification and well-being through problem-focused coping. Please take it away.
Thanks. I'm back again. So this was actually Victoria's undergraduate honors thesis, but she was unable to present, so I said, I'll definitely present. To start off, well-being, there are over 100 different indicators of well-being, and if you go to that Linton paper, you can find all of them. But generally, when you do factor analyses, they kind of end up falling onto one of two dimensions. One is subjective well-being, including indicators such as your level of happiness, your satisfaction with your life. And the other dimension tends to be psychological well-being. For example, feeling like you have a purpose in life, you have positive relationships with other people. So that's just a general overview of what well-being is in psychology. And more specifically, the COVID pandemic has hindered individuals' well-being. Here are some of the more recent findings. Well, it had to be recent, coming out. And I gotta say, when COVID hit and the pandemic hit, I was like, I'm not gonna jump on this fad of research. And then I got dragged onto this paper. But COVID has resulted in people feeling more anxious, more disordered eating, greater levels of loneliness and depression, and decreases in satisfactions of one's basic needs. In other words, COVID impairs one's well-being. There are different ways that people cope with trauma and situations, stressful situations. Probably the research shows one of the best ways of coping with a difficult situation is through problem-focused coping. Here's a definition of that, which is adopting a strategy that aims to take control of a situation. So you would acknowledge that the situation is stressful. People would tend to seek social support for helping to solve whatever the problem is. And then actively trying to find a solution to that problem. So that is problem-focused coping. And over the vast majority of studies, problem-focused coping is related to better well-being compared to other types of coping, such as withdrawal or avoiding whatever the stressful thing is. Fandom and well-being has a link between them. I'll talk more about that in a later talk. What time is that? 5:30. But there's growing evidence that fandom identification, or the degree of psychological connection that you feel with other fans in the fan community, is related to better well-being. And in this example, this was a mediation model that we put out, and we had different functions that people get from belonging to fandoms. One is a purpose in life. One is it provides an escape from the daily hassles and stress of life. And the third function in that paper was social connections, forging and maintaining friendships within the community. And in that mediation model, what we see is fandom predicts better well-being, fandom identification. And then when you stick in these things in the middle, the association between fandom goes away. And I'm not supposed to say it like this, but I'll say it like this. The relationship goes away because you include social connections. In other words, it's the social connections that you make that help with your well-being, not necessarily the purpose in life or escapism. So in this present study, what we did is we got samples of Star Wars fans and furries. We do a lot of research with furries. So the fandom measure, there's an example item I strongly identify with other fans of this interest. You could switch that, adapt the measure to be like, I strongly identify with other Star Wars fans in the Star Wars community. And we gave them a measure of coping, and specifically we were focused on the problem-focused coping in part of that measure. And then a measure of psychological well-being. So for example, I feel like I have purpose in life. And we also got a measure from the APA, the American Psychological Association, about a degree of stress that COVID is causing people. So we give different examples, like getting coronavirus yourself, rated on a scale of 1, that is little or no stress to me, versus 10 being a great deal of stress. So here are the correlations between these measures. On the top is the furry, above the diagonal is the furry sample, and below that is the Star Wars fan sample. And what we see is that well-being is related to problem-focused coping. So the higher you rated on, you deal with situations by using problem-focused coping, the better well-being those individuals had. For the furries, there was the association between fandom identification and well-being, but we did not see that significant correlation. The correlation is in the right direction, but it wasn't significant for the Star Wars fans. And then, as we would hope, there was a correlation between fandom, so how much you feel connected to the other fans in the community, and more problem-focused coping. So the first test model we tested was just a simple mediation model with fandom leading to well-being through greater problem-focused coping. And we did find that for the furries, but we did not find it in the Star Wars fans. And we'll be discussing possible reasons for that later. But 0 was not within the confidence interval, meaning that fandom predicts well-being because of problem-focused coping. Then what we did is a mediated or a moderated mediation, which is different than a mediated moderation, whatever, we don't care about that, which is as stress goes up, does the link between fandom and problem-focused coping get stronger? And does the link between fandom and well-being get stronger as more and more stress is piled on the fans? And what we found is it does for furries, especially at the mid-level, and as stress went up, that mediation got stronger. In other words, furries were more likely to seek out social support within their community, but we did not see it in the Star Wars fandom. So in terms of conclusions, fandom and coping related in both of the samples, also coping and well-being, but we didn't see the fandom and well-being in the Star Wars sample. The more COVID stressed out fans, the increased relationship, the mediation for furries, but not for the Star Wars fans. So no mediation or moderation for Star Wars. One thing could be Star Wars fans don't really rely on the fandom for social support in times of need. And their mean level of fandom identification was lower than furries, indicating that furries are more connected within the community, fan community, than Star Wars fans are. And another possible reason is that Star Wars is more mainstream. So here was a different study we did where we asked undergraduate students to rate how stereotypical or prototypical it is to be a fan of various different popular fan things in the US. And we did like sport, 10 from sport, 10 from media, 10 from music, and 10 from hobby. And on the bottom there is the prototypicality. So the higher it is, the more prototypical or stereotypical it is to be a fan of that thing. And then on the side is a measure of prejudice. Specifically, higher scores indicate more positive attitudes toward fans of those different interests. And Star Wars is above the midpoint. In other words, Star Wars is showing that, well, let me say it a different way. Here are furries. Undergraduate students said that it's not prototypical to be a furry, and they did not like furries. Whereas Star Wars was higher up, and it was more prototypical to be a fan of Star Wars, and people have more positive feelings towards fans of Star Wars. So it's just indicating that it's more mainstream. And so maybe the reason is this psychological model called the rejection identification model, which is the more society stigmatizes a group, the more those group members band together for social support, which can buffer against the well-being detriments that stigma against your group can have on one's well-being. So it might be that Star Wars is more mainstream. They don't really go to each other for social support, whereas the furries less mainstream, and they do go to other people for their social support. So I knew this paper was going to be short, and so the talk was going to be short. So I'm going to talk about a different study. Helping. And this recently came out as its advanced online publication right now in Leisure. But if you want a copy, feel free to email me so you can get by that paywall that all those big journals have. one of the reasons why I love the Phoenix papers. It is not behind a paywall. And this is in conjunction with the International Anime Research Project. Again, our next study is going to be in August. Just Google our name and you can find our website and sign up and get an email when that survey comes out. And then I email maybe 2 or 3 times a year saying changes to the project, what new has come out. So let's go through what we talked about in that paper. Social identity theory is a theory that most of my research revolves around, and it has, I'll talk about it more in the later talks today. One of the things is we tend to help in-group members over out-group members. So we show in-group favoritism in a variety of tasks. In that first citation, what they did is they went to soccer games and they set up booths. One was connected with the home team, one was the away team, and they were asking for donations. The dependent variable, what they were measuring was how much in terms of donations do each of these booths get. And the home team got more money than the rival team's charity did. And let me give you a different example, which I love this study. I loved it so much, I even made little stick figure drawings of it to explain it. The research participants were brought into the lab. They knew what they were a fan of. And so they get into the laboratory and the researchers ask them to fill out a measure about how much you love, you're connected to whatever the fan thing is. In this example, the Chiefs. And so the participant salient identity is the Chiefs. They say you need to go to another building to do a second part of this study. So while the participant is walking to this other building, in their head, cognitively activated identity was a fan of the Chiefs. And they see a participant, or they see a person on the path, and this person is Confederate, which means they're in on the study, but the participant doesn't know that. And the Confederate it falls down, acts like they hurt themselves. And the Confederate is either wearing the in-group symbol, so the Chiefs t-shirt, wearing a neutral shirt, or wearing the rival team's shirt. And the question is, does the participant stop and help this person who has fallen down and hurt themselves? And as we see in the data, whether or not they stopped to help the injured person, they stopped and helped much more if they were wearing an in-group member shirt versus out-group or the neutral shirt. But again, it just shows in-group helping other members of your in-group. There's also, within this theory, there's a lot of talk about norms of the group. And we find in the Brony fandom that there's a norm of helping other people. And the more you identify or feel connected to the Brony fandom, the more likely you are to help other people. For example, donating blood and giving to charity and whatnot. There's also a growing amount of research showing that helping other people is related to your own well-being. So if I go help somebody else, I feel good afterwards. And this is shown for a variety of different behaviors, such as giving to other people is linked to happiness. And in that research, it was something like, think about a time you spent $20 on yourself versus think about a time you spent $20 on another person, not on yourself. And then rate your happiness. And happiness is higher if you're thinking about that time you helped somebody. But well-being is also related to, for example, donating to charity, volunteering, doing some sort of pro-social activism, or just random acts of kindness are all related to the person helping having better well-being, rating their own well-being higher afterwards. So in this study, what we did is we sampled bronies, we sampled anime fans, and we sampled furries. We gave them measures of fandom identification, the extent that they help other people within their fandom, so within group helping. And in studies 1 and 2, we measured self-esteem, and then in study 3, we had a longer measure of well-being. And I'm going to go on a tangent here and say self-esteem is an indicator of well-being. Every time I say this, a reviewer will say, it's not an indicator. There was 2 different concepts. Self-esteem is basically an evaluation of your self-worth. And people continuously argue with me that it's not an indicator of well-being. And then I have to write a whole paragraph explaining why it is. For example, it's strongly correlated with subjective well-being measures, strongly correlated with psychological well-being measures. If you run a factor analysis of all these different indicators, it falls on the subjective well-being factor. In this large cross-national study of 31 different nations, self-esteem was always related to satisfaction with one's life. In this huge meta-analysis, it is clearly negatively related to depression. In other words, it's always correlated. It's a good indicator of well-being. Anyway, that was my tangent, sorry. So here were the items we did for intra-group helping, the extent that, this is the breakdown for the anime fans. The highest in terms of what the most frequent helping behavior the anime fans did was giving advice to other people, but also giving emotional support to other fans in the community. But those are still below the midpoint, but we're not worried about means on this study. We're more worried about connections and correlations and regression coefficients. Anyway, so we did a mediation analysis with fandom identification predicting self-esteem in studies 1 and 2, and then fandom identification predicting well-being in study 3. And what we find it, and then when you stick in intragroup helping, does the relationship go change significantly? And what we find is that the more that you are identified with your fandom, the more likely you are to help other people in the fandom, which then leads to greater well-being for fans. And we found that in the Brony fandom, we found it in the anime fandom, and we found it in the furry fandom. So some conclusions about that study. We suspect that the reason intragroup helping or helping other fans is related to well-being is it makes opportunities to connect with other people. And it goes right back to that social connections, especially face-to-face, which I'll talk more about in a later talk. It had also contributed to the literature in terms of, yes, helping other people is related to better well-being for the helper. And it also shows that if we see it across, anime, brony, and furry, this is a common underlying psychological mechanism within fan communities, but also within groups in general. And that's all I have on that. Thank you. Questions?
Looks like no questions for this one.
Awesome.
All right. Oh. All right. Well, thank you again, Stephen. And I guess we'll take just sort of a mini impromptu break before we get started on our keynote with the ever delightful Dr. Deborah Scally.
Oh, I'll see you at 5:30.